Good afternoon. I call the Committee of the Whole on Bill 31 to order, and we are on Clause 2. I'm recognizing the member from Salmon Arm, Shuswap.
Thank you, Your Honor. And good afternoon to everybody here. Glad to get back looking at Clause 2 of this bill. To start with, through the chair to the minister, I have a few questions I'd like to cover. Going back to on Clause 2, subsection 3A. This is for application for existing and future customers. If the minister does not intend to prohibit the sale of electricity to existing customers or pre-existing projects, can the minister please explain why subsection 3A is drafted so broadly that it also applies to both existing and future projects?
Minister.
It applies to projects existing in the queue as well as future projects.
Member.
Thank you to the chair, and thank you to the minister for the answer. If it's pertained to some projects that are in the queue, would the minister please explain some of the projects that are in the queue? And if you are going to use these powers to affect any existing powers, would you entertain an amendment restricting some of the powers to some of the new or pre-existing?
Minister.
In these areas, remember we're talking about limited areas in Section 2. They'll go into the process.
Recognizing the member.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you to the minister. We'll move on to Clause 2, subsection 3B. This has more to do with duplication and rate setting. Can the minister explain why the government requires the authority to enforce rates under subsection 3B, 1 to 4, when BC Utilities Commission already sets just and reasonable rates for industrial customers?
Minister.
I'm happy to answer this question for the third or fourth time, Honourable Speaker. If, in fact, in the process that one of the conditions looked at is price and return to the people of the province, return to BC Hydro, that's the ability to set rates. And as we've established and said, maybe more than a dozen times, the BC Utilities Commission doesn't set rates.
Member.
Thank you to the minister, and thank you, Chair. To the minister through the chair. Can the minister please explain why the government is giving itself the power to set rates while simultaneously giving itself the authority to require and allow BC UC to set rates?
Minister.
Well, I just answered this question. We're setting up an allocation framework that we've detailed now extensively in the House, and on this specific question we've answered a number of times. Government, of course, on occasion does have the power to set rates, and it did through most of the previous government's last half. But set that aside, BCUC doesn't set rates. It reviews rate applications by BC Hydro, which also is in that business when you're establishing an allocation framework that includes the issue of return to BC Hydro and return to the people of the province. That allocation framework, which we're setting up through regulation here and establishing in this bill, requires that, and that it will be BC Hydro that manages that process, as we've said a number of times in this debate.
Recognizing the member.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the minister. And I thank you for the clarification. And I apologize for any duplication of any questions, right? Just want to get to the bottom of and clarify some of the facts. Maybe the minister can tell me why the government just didn't simply direct BC Hydro to establish new rate classes or tariffs instead of centralizing rate-setting power within the cabinet? And also, second to that question, when we're going to be setting rates and there's going to be an allocation and there's going to be different rate setting, is there going to be any consultation prior, and will they be publicized?
Recognizing the minister.
The purpose of this section is to set up an allocation framework in the areas of artificial intelligence, data centers, and hydrogen for export. There will be an opportunity in a transparent manner based on criteria, yes, set up after consultation with industry, with First Nations, with many others, indeed with the opposition, as I committed to yesterday, in terms of what those criteria are. The allocation framework will be set up in a transparent way, and a competition will be held by BC Hydro. Part of that competition is this issue of rates. So I think since we've gone through this, and leaders of the Green Party, the member for Peace River South, and the member have gone through this before, I just say that that is what's happening in this case. And so this isn't the creation of new rate classes, as he suggests. Quite the contrary, Honourable Speaker. It's a process and an allocation framework that allows companies and people who wish in those areas to access BC's inexpensive clean electricity, to have that opportunity and to make their best bids in the interest of the people of BC. And I look forward to the members' contribution to what those criteria should be.
Member.
Thank you to the minister, and thank you, Chair. That leads me right into the next question. Does the government intend on charging or rationing electricity customers at higher rates, one rate class over another, than other industrial customers?
Minister.
What this allocation framework does is assure that those industries and those projects that have the greatest return to British Columbia in terms of jobs, in terms of wealth, in terms of royalty, will continue to have access to electricity and not make the choice of simply leaving it open to rapidly scaling industries like other jurisdictions have. This provision protects ratepayers, which the government continues and certainly has demonstrated in its record. I think the member would agree with this. 12% below the rate of inflation since 2017 in hydro rate increases is consistently done. So, Honourable Speaker, with respect to generation of electricity, this is a question responded a number of times, and the opposition has made it clear they're not in favour of transmission in terms of the North Coast transmission line. You require transmission of electricity delivered to customers. They're not in favour of generation. We've put forward calls for power that the opposition has opposed. All of that said, Honourable Speaker, BC Hydro, as demonstrated in detail in the Integrated Resources Plan, is continuing to build for what is a very exciting period in BC life, where demand for electricity will grow because the economy will grow, and we need to, as BC Hydro, as it always has, to be there for the BC economy to ensure that people have access to electricity, to create jobs, wealth, and of course to heat their homes and to enjoy all the benefits of having public utility.
Member.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the minister. We definitely agree on we want to see the economy grow, and we certainly do believe we want to see as many customers get the power that they need. We do not want to restrict any kind of power or any kind of ability to get that power, and we certainly want this economy to grow in this province. My question to the minister is that will the government delegate rate setting for rationed customers to BC Hydro? And if so, what oversight will the BCUC provide?
Minister.
Honourable Speaker, all of that, Honourable Speaker, is not what the section does, as we've established over time. The opposition may disagree with the section, but it really has nothing to do with that particular analysis. As I've said, more than a dozen times, happy to say it at 13th, Honourable Speaker, that BCUC doesn't set rates, and that under this government, as opposed to the previous government, rates have gone down against the rate of inflation, which I think the member would agree is a good thing. And so our concern with rates is clearly demonstrated by the section we're discussing, which to ensure that we pace growth in rapidly scalable industries so that we are able to insulate ratepayers and ensure that people that when we make choices about the clean electricity BC has in those rapidly scalable industries, we make choices in the public interest. And I'm interested, certainly interested in the member's view of the public interest at that point, but on that point, Honourable Speaker, but the question and what's implied in the question is simply not correct.
Member.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Minister. My understanding is that the last rate by the BC Hydro was actually overrode by Cabinet and wasn't currently set by the BCUC. And so, you know, we want to make sure that going down the road that whoever is in charge of setting the rates, whether it be BC Hydro or BCUC, that there's actually input from groups, including the public, so that rates reflect the costs, and that the taxpayer is actually getting a good, or the ratepayer is actually getting a good, good return for their money. We do applaud the fact that rates have been kept low, but the fact is that was overrode by order on council, as far as my understanding was. My question to the Minister is going back to subsection 3D and 3E. Under subsection 3D, can the Minister outline what rules or procedures a public utility must follow to select which customers are eligible to receive electricity service for a listed purpose?
Minister.
Yesterday, the member for Peace River South put forward an amendment to this very provision, which asked for the input of the opposition, which, well, the amendment didn't succeed. I've certainly agreed to hearing and having them involved in that process to set criteria. Other members have put forward other amendments on this section. This is the section of the bill where we set criteria under the allocation framework criteria, such as return to the province, data sovereignty, jobs, and so on, Honourable Speaker, which is the subject of this section of the bill. So the member knows, and that's why, and that's the role, and we certainly will be involved in everyone in setting that role. And then it will be BC Hydro's responsibility, based on those criteria, to run a competition for access to that power, and that's what this section is about.
Member.
I thank the Minister. I just wanted to get clarity, because we certainly want to make sure that allocation is based on merit. We want to make sure that, you know, it based on basic main requirements will benefit this province the best or most needed. Going to subsection 3E, can the Minister explain what competitive process will look like under subsection 3E1?
Minister.
So as we've discussed on a number of occasions here, this is the allocation process. So the criteria would be set by regulation, and it would be BC Hydro's responsibility to run what's effectively a competition, a request for requests for BC Hydro's clean power in these sectors, artificial intelligence and data centers in particular. And so that is the process that's being set up here, and the allocation decisions will be made by BC Hydro in the way that they do in many competitions, including recent calls for power that we've discussed in this committee a number of times.
Member.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Minister. Can the Minister guarantee that his instructions to BC Hydro will to make sure that the criteria is public knowledge?
Minister.
The criteria will be public knowledge, the regulations will be published, and then there will be an open request for proposal. There will be an intake period for requests for proposals, that projects will submit proposals, those will be evaluated. BC Hydro will determine the electricity allocation for the projects, and then successful projects will formally enter into the interconnection queue. So that's the full process.
Member.
I thank the Minister, and so I can skip my next question because that had to do with criteria. To the Minister, will the public, the legislature, or affected industries be able to review these criteria before they're enacted?
Minister.
Well, in the development of these regulations, and I've laid out, I would say probably at least 20 times what I expect those criteria to be. There'll be, of course, a consultation process involving groups before the criteria are set. Then they'll be made public, and then there'll be an open process where that's laid out for all people who want to seek access for power. That process will be done as requests for proposal processes are done, typically at BC Hydro under the support of an ethics advisor, and BC Hydro will determine based on the criteria and based on, of course, most importantly, the proposals, the allocation of power.
Recognizing the member from Burnaby. Oh, Boundary Silkameen. Sorry about that.
Good.
I have these reading glasses on.
Thank you, Chair. To the Minister, through you, you'd mentioned the interconnection queue, and it twigged something for me. I'm wondering, will the Cabinet commit to continuing to publish an annual industrial demand queue report?
Minister.
Well, obviously, we don't publish the queue of companies because that would be confidential information for those companies. But what we do is publish, and we've just done that in the last couple of weeks, the Integrated Resources Plan, which lays out in detail BC Hydro's both demand forecasts and generation plans for the period. So all that's available in public in hundreds of pages, and it's currently under review by the BC Utilities Commission.
Member.
And would the companies that were either curtailed or managed through this bill be included in, like, would we know that those companies have demand that we're not serving? Would that be included in that report?
Minister.
Yeah, there would be, we're talking about a process, an allocation framework process that I've described on a number of occasions here in this House, in this committee. And so at the end of that process, what happens typically is that successful proponents are contacted and unsuccessful ones are as well. They have the opportunity typically to meet with BC Hydro on requests for proposals. And information, not detailed information, we wouldn't be publishing the names of unsuccessful companies, obviously, in those processes, but that process would be very public and there would be a report on the allocation process done by BC Hydro that would be publicly available, the criteria publicly available, the process is publicly available. Obviously, the bids aren't publicly available in the sense that companies that take part in such processes are often competitors with other companies, and they would want that information to be confidential, but they certainly, should they not succeed, would have occasion as unsuccessful participants, say in the call for power, to discuss that with BC Hydro.
Member.
Thank you. I appreciate the background and the Minister's knowledge for sure. While we can't say who they are, would he be tracking specifically what sectors and how much load we are theoretically waiting for power to serve?
Minister.
Yeah, there's detailed information about that in the Integrated Resources Plan, in particular for the Northwest, which is of interest to the other clause in the bill, which we've passed in this House. But there is detailed information on that, including information on industrial demand by industry. So we know that there was literally thousands of megawatts of demand from cryptocurrency. We've satisfied 140 before the ban came in. And the argument was that we should have that power for industries that contribute more to communities such as those in the members' riding, and that's why that decision was taken and was supported without opposition in the legislature at that time. So we do have that information. Equally, on data centers, we know that approximately 1,400 megawatts of demand is available. That doesn't mean they're at the point of making contracts or anything else, but information has been sought around that, for example. So a lot of that information is in the IRP, and of course it'll be affected by this process because we're making decisions to ensure the existing access for a whole range of industries supported by massive new generation in our province on the one hand, and on the other hand, quite a bit of power. When you think about it. I mean, I know we think 150 megawatts, and people have a hard time envisioning that. That's 30 megawatts bigger than the biggest industrial load now in the whole province, which is Highland Valley Copper. So 150 a year, or 450 megawatts over 3 years is a lot of power, for example, for artificial intelligence. And we're saying we should do that, and BC Hydro should do that, and they should do that in a way that supports the public interest, which is what this section is about.
Recognizing the member from Prince George, North Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the Minister. In this bill, has there been consideration being made in the ownership agreements with regards to protection of critical infrastructure? Has there been any effort made to ensure that critical infrastructure is examined, carefully prepared for protection? There's a lot of threats to critical infrastructure, and in terms of an emergency, in case of disruptions of power, or in case of or limited disruption, if there's been any thought to looking at critical infrastructure protection in this particular bill. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, I'm not sure if the member is asking about the North Coast Transmission Line, which is the subject of Section 1, which has been passed by the committee, or the allocation framework, which is very different in Section 2. We've had an extensive discussion with respect to the North Coast Transmission Line on this very question. BC Hydro will operate the North Coast Transmission Line, and obviously it does an excellent job around our province of dealing with the transmission system, and has for a long time. And when problems emerge, it addresses those, I think people will appreciate, with real determination, speed, and the outstanding teams at BC Hydro do that. So I think the member's probably asking about the North Coast Transmission Line and the building of transmission line. On the allocation framework, that's really not anything to do with what he's asking.
Recognizing the member for Salmon Arm Shoe Swap.
Welcome to the new chair. And thank you to the Minister. My question to the Minister is on subsection 3F of Clause 2. Why does the government need the ability to authorize a public utility to recover costs it incurs or revenue it expects to lose as a result of regulation under this section?
Recognizing the Minister.
So this was answered a couple times yesterday. I'm happy to answer it again. If money is provided by those in the queue who ultimately don't succeed, then it's recoverable by BC Hydro.
Recognizing the member for Salmon Arm Shoe Swap.
I thank the chair, and I thank the Minister for having to repeat himself so many times. I appreciate his indulgence. My question to the Minister is that, are existing residential, commercial, or industrial customers at risk of paying the costs of government's rationing decisions?
Recognizing the Minister.
Quite the contrary, I would say. What we're doing is establishing the appropriate amount and allocations for particular industries. It's not a small amount. As I've noted, 450 megawatts for AI over the next 3 years, which would be a significant amount, 150 megawatts for data centers. And we've assessed that we can have an excellent competition that prioritizes BC's priorities in that area. It's the idea that is unfettered, that is causing massive rate increases all over North America. And that is the reason why other jurisdictions, such as Utah, such as Pennsylvania, such as New York, such as Quebec, such as Ontario, such as Manitoba, have acted in the same area in order to protect ratepayers from rapidly scalable demand, which then would go on the rate base. And so we're engaged, having learned from all those experiences, the 22% increases that people in New Jersey are facing now as a result of data centers, which itself increased costs on all the other industries in that state when you see that level of increase, as well as individuals in a very difficult time. That's the purpose of this legislation. And so the government, which has done, I think, a very good job, and BC Hydro, and a very good job since 2017, of ensuring that rates stay low, 12% under the rate of inflation, third lowest rates in North America, have really tied with the two other public health hydro systems. Will continue to do so.
Recognizing the member for Salmon Arms,
Thank you,
Shuswap.
Chair, and thank you to the Minister. The one thing we agree on is that we do agree that we have very good rates in this province, and we're debating this bill here today because we want to make sure that in the future, rates in British Columbia still are the most competitive in North America or the world. That is good for residential customers, but it's also good for industry. My question to the Minister, can the Minister describe what types of costs might be incurred or what kinds of revenues might be lost and which customer classes would be expected to pay?
Recognizing the minister.
Well, it's the same question on the same section, and the answer is the same, which is that these are customers in the queue who might have spent money to be in the queue, and that BC Hydro is able to recover that foregone revenue.
We're on clause 2. Shall clause recognizing the leader of the third party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome. I'd like to table an amendment, please. May I speak to it? Well, if this bill passes as is, under Clause D, Lieutenant Governor and Council may make regulations to establish procedures or rules by which a public utility must select which persons are eligible to receive electricity service for the listed purposes. We've already attempted an amendment on that. It was defeated. Moving down to paragraph E, requiring a public utility to conduct a competitive process. The minister has talked about BC Hydro running a process to select who will receive electricity service. Subsection 2 also gives, would have Cabinet reach right into the competitive process, directing the criteria rules for conducting the competitive process. I would suggest this is too far, and that I've submitted an amendment that changes that to directing the public utility to establish criteria rules for conducting the competitive process consistent with the earlier procedures or rules that the Cabinet would set. It seems reasonable that they would use that, but that the public utility should conduct that competitive process with some independence without having Cabinet dictate what rules it uses for the process. I'll leave that with the chair. Thank you.
Okay, we will take a short recess and come back in 5 minutes. Whole on Bill 31 back to order. Having reviewed the amendment, it's deemed to be in order, so we'll allow for debate on the amendment. The member's already spoken, so Minister, if you'd like to respond, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the member and I have had an exchange about the BC Utilities Commission and whether it should be setting economic policy. And I made the distinction about their role and the government's role in that respect. Here, the member is essentially putting economic policy in the hands of BC Hydro and its executives and its board. And while in the case of its board, it would be appointed by me, removing that authority from a process where the cabinet take responsibility, publishes regulations, and then goes forward seems to be a better process than having BC Hydro itself determine criteria or rules for conducting the competitive process itself. This is more transparent. BC Hydro's role is then to implement that agenda and to have a fair competition based on the criteria rules set forth by in that case, the cabinet. After consultation, the consultation will take place on those criteria that the member will be aware of. So I don't support the amendment for really the same reason as the previous one. It has a similar effect to what and I don't think I don't know what the member's view would be on reflection, but I don't think simply diverting that responsibility for economic policy and for setting the criteria to BC Hydro would be the right approach. It might be, depending on how you view the responsibility. I'm certainly the minister responsible for BC Hydro for that. But I think the appropriate place here, based on the legislation, would be a cabinet process setting the criteria, and then BC Hydro running the competition, not BC Hydro setting the criteria and rules and then running the competition. So that's why I disagree with the member. I understand the case he's putting forward, but I disagree with it, and I think the approach in the bill itself is a better approach than what he's suggesting.
Seeing no further questions on the amendment, shall the amendment pass? Aye. A division's been called.
Jeremy's a
Before putting the questions, I remind all members that only members of Section A or their duly appointed substitutes are authorized to vote. The question is on the amendment moved by the leader of the third party. Those in favor, please rise or indicate otherwise. Thank you, members. You may be seated. Those voting nay, please rise or indicate otherwise. Thank you, members. You may be seated. Clerk?
Those voting aye, Neufeld, Mock, Williams, Valeri at 4. Those voting nay, Dix, Shaw, Chandra, Herbert, Brar, Lejeunesse, 5.
The amendment is defeated. Okay. Recognizing the member for Salmon Arm Shoe Swap.
Thank you, Chair. Did you want to wait for the staff? Go ahead. Okay. Okay, my question to the minister, after our little short delay there, is regarding subsection 4B. Under subsection 4B, can the minister please explain why the government is allowing BC Hydro to regulate itself through an order in council?
Recognizing the minister.
Well, Hydro isn't governing itself. It delegates to BC Hydro based on the criteria, the question of who would be selected and who would not be selected in the allocation competition that would occur.
We're on clause 2, recognizing the member for Salmon Arm Shoe Swap.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the minister. Going back to subsection 4B, is granting a regulated monopoly the ability to regulate its own activities through a cabinet order considered normal regulatory practice? That's a mouthful.
And I would just remind members that there is no eating in the committee room. Recognizing the minister.
Well, Cabinet's giving the authority publicly and clearly in a regulation, and then BC Hydro is acting on it. It's not regulating itself. BC Hydro, just as an example, the call for power. There's a call for power in BC. Criterion rules were set for that call for power, and then BC Hydro managed that. That would be the case for many or most government agencies in the way that activities take place.
Recognizing the member for Salmon Arm Shoe Swap.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the minister. Going on to subsection 4C. Under subsection 4C, what procedures does the government anticipate establishing via order in council? I know it's hypothetical.
Recognizing the minister.
The selection process.
We're on clause 2, recognizing the member for Salmon Arm Shoe Swap.
Thank you for the speedy answer. And thank you, Chair. My question to the minister through the chair is, will these procedures be made public? And again, will stakeholders be consulted?
Recognizing the minister.
Yeah, we had this discussion yesterday. Indeed, the opposition moved a number of amendments on this question. And so the answer is that in the development of the criteria and the rules, I've laid out what I expect generally those rules to be, the kind of criteria that you'd expect out of sovereignty, value to BC Hydro, et cetera. And that will all be publicly done. And then the process will be a public process that would have to for people to participate in. The rules will be clearly set out. The process will be clearly set out, as it frequently is in BC Hydro processes, such as the call for power.
Recognizing the members for Salmon Arm Shoe Swap.
Thank you to the minister. I just wanted to clarify that through every step of the procedure that there would be clarity to the public. And I thank you to the chair. My question to the minister through the chair is, this bill does not address technological unknowns. For example, AI data centers may be dramatically reduce the usage of electricity they may require in the future, or there may be other technologies that are more advanced that require less electricity or less demand on the system. Can the minister please explain what steps or processes would be required to adjust allocations if demand declines or technologies dramatically change?
Recognizing the Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions.
Well, as would be clear to the member, if the industry become more efficient, you get more successful participants at the existing level.
We're on Clause 2. Shall Clause 2, recognizing the member for Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair, and haven't been engaged in discussion on Bill 31 in this committee stage yet, but happy to join the discussion. And it relates to my own riding as well. And that's why I'm choosing to rise today to speak to it. Overall, Clause 2, we're talking about allocation. And allocation for different purposes, allocation by cabinet, for power in this province. And I'll use an example from the community of Mackenzie in my riding. So the Camphor pulp mill was closed a few years ago, unfortunately impacting hundreds of jobs in the community, and a large scale infrastructure not being there has been a socioeconomic harm. So since that time, there obviously was a surplus of power that was in the community of Mackenzie. Because of that, it wasn't being used. But, so BC Hydro at the time, there was options available. So there was a cryptocurrency operation that's set up. Iris Energy has built a Bitcoin mine in Mackenzie. Other proponents have looked at the community as well because of that surplus power. So there was a surplus power up to a certain point that Iris needed, and then there was a second surplus that was still not allocated yet. BC Hydro actually took that away from the community of Mackenzie and allocated it elsewhere. And part of that, of course, is there's a system impact study process. And as we're talking about this bill overall, part of the rationale that the government, I believe, is trying to use is that the system impact study process is broken. It's not working as it was intended. The queue doesn't work anymore, that system, for the industrial proponents that want access to power in BC Hydro's system. So with that, we have LNG projects, we have mining projects, we have the Port of Prince Rupert that are looking at it potentially as an option to get on to BC Hydro's grid. But what they also need to look at is the fact that communities need to be involved in those discussions on allocation. And in Mackenzie's example, BC Hydro took allocation away from their community at their discretion, but there was no discussion with Mackenzie whatsoever. So when they're looking at brownfield renewal for that site, redevelopment potential for that site, at that former Camphor pulp site, they've now lost that opportunity to offer power to that industrial customer unless they can figure out a way to navigate the system impact study process. So I guess my question to the minister is, with this new model, how are communities actually going to be consulted about the allocation of power in a community like Mackenzie?
Recognizing the Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions.
Certainly, communities will be participating in the process of setting criteria. What we're talking about is an allocation framework for AI, for data centers, and potentially for hydrogen for export, although that would likely not be launched immediately because the possibility for that isn't there at the moment. And so the criteria would be set out, and certainly community impacts and community issues would be part of that, in addition to jobs and data sovereignty and the other criteria set in the process. And BC Hydro would run the process for the allocation of power for AI and for data centers and potentially for hydrogen for export. And there would be successful proponents based on the criteria. And BC Hydro would run that process as they do, for example, call for power processes. In that case, the call for power process is an indication of that, where rules are set, and then BC Hydro runs the process. In the case of the most recent successful call for power, you saw successful projects, for example, in the Prince George area, but also in the Northwest, in the Northeast, in the Nicola Valley, in the Kelowna area, and Vancouver Island. So that process, obviously, one of the advantages of that process and the decision to make it in the criteria in that case, maximum of 200, meaning there was multiple projects selected and not just all of the new generation concentrated in one community, benefited from that. And I think the result of the call for power, both on price and on the distribution of those projects throughout the province, was very successful. So that would be part of it, and certainly local governments will be invited to be part of the engagement process around the regulations.
Recognizing the member for Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair, and recognize that certainly the calls for power have happened throughout the region. Still firm power being needed, but we'll leave that aside. I'll also leave aside for a moment, I'll get back to in a moment the AI and cryptocurrency piece. I just want to have a follow-up question on the community consultation side of things. So Mackenzie, with this allocation that through the current problem that we have with Hydro's process, losing that industrial power for the former Camfor site, what that has done is it actually, Camfor just this year was able to be based on selling the site and not actually occupying it. They're no longer required to pay their full industrial tax to the community. So that's a $1 million hit to a small community's budget, annual budget. And so when we're talking about power allocation, we're actually talking about municipal and local government, regional district budgeting as well in this case. So my question is really, how are regional districts and local governments going to be consulted when Cabinet makes allocation decisions that affect local government budgets, their bottom line for their taxpayers? Because I think local governments are going to want to know. This example in Mackenzie has hurt the community, and they're scrambling right now. There's a company right now that has purchased the Camfor site, as I've just said. BMI Group, they're a redevelopment firm from Ontario. But their problem is that right now they're trying to figure out how to get access to power on the site so they can incentivize economic development on a brownfield site in a community that is desperate for economic development. So my question is, how is when we're looking at Cabinet being able to allocate this power, how are communities actually going to be involved in that discussion when this is so centralized in Victoria?
Recognizing the Minister.
Well, a version of this question has been answered a number of times, let's say, in this debate. Cabinet isn't picking the winners or losers. What's being set is the criteria. And then BC Hydro will run a competition based on those criteria, as it did, for example, in a different process for the call for power overseen in that process, always in those significant processes by an ethics advisor. So Cabinet is not allocating the power. We're determining essentially the important criteria that BC Hydro will use in assessing that, which will include, as always, as they would in a call for power, as you would understand, price to the ratepayer, which is an important consideration, but other considerations. In the case of the call for power, there was a minimum First Nations participation of 25%, and that was met in all the cases, and that was a requirement in that process. So Cabinet will be doing it and consulting on those things, but Cabinet won't be allocating the power or choosing the winners and losers. This has been a discussion we've had with a number of members. I'm happy to have it maybe more briefly with the member given that. But that's the process envisaged here for this. For other industries, of course, it continues to be the existing allocation framework, which is first come, first served, such as, for example, forestry. And we want to ensure, part of the reason we're building the Northwest Transmission Line and building out all these generation and transmission and distribution investments is to ensure that, for example, mines and forestry and ports and LNG and others have access to BC Clean Power. And that's why you're seeing this major generation change and interest and expansion of generation. The member will know, and we've had, again, this discussion a number of times in the debate, happy to have it again if briefly, is that there's been relatively flat demand back to about 2007 from BC Hydro. Partly that's because of the success of some conservation initiatives. Partly, as was discussed yesterday, and we discussed at some length, the impact of reductions really starting in the 2000s in the forest industry. And you can see that in the effects of communities and families of closures, but you can also see it in how power is used in the province, and Mackenzie is an example of that. So that's what this allocation framework, which is limited to these areas, how it will happen, and communities will have an opportunity to advise the government on what the criteria are in this economic in importance, and obviously data sovereignty, I think we'd all agree would be important for BC, but jobs and communities and other circumstances would also be important.
Recognizing the member for Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, obviously there's been a long, in the course of the past several days, there's been a disagreement on the Cabinet's role in this and in the interpretation we're seeing. Obviously, we would say that Cabinet is being given too much power to be able to allocate here in this case, and arbitrary decision-making is not something that we want to see. We want it based on fair market principles. And part of that, obviously, I appreciate that the Minister referenced the importance of data sovereignty. I have no really qualms about the idea of limiting the cryptocurrency kind of allocation at this time, because I think that is fair because of the shortage of power we have in this province at the moment. But on the data sovereignty side, obviously, there are existing proponents, obviously, and some of them have been discussed, I think, already. Iris Energy has operations both in Prince George and Mackenzie, actually, and they in Prince George they have AI data processing, and in Mackenzie that's what they have. They had intentions to expand to that, and they have actually already they have power allocated for that to expand into that. It's in their near-term plans. So I'm wondering how those existing data center operations that have I'll just wait a moment. So I know, welcome to the chair. There are existing data centers, Iris Energy in Prince George and Mackenzie. We have in Canal Flats, other operations. What discussion has the ministry had with, in terms of consultation with those existing operations and their near-term plans about where they fit into the allocation that will be provided to data processing overall?
Recognize the minister.
So just as an example to the member, and we have an active example of how such allocation takes place with the crypto question. There are about 140 megawatts of crypto mining, essentially, that are currently in the BC Hydro load. And when the decision was made not to say no to further ones, we continue to provide that service to those companies. So if there's companies that are have existing operations that are electrified in BC, that electricity in BC, they'll be unaffected. They're our base customers. We're not kicking people off, and we didn't when we shut off. We shut off the opportunity for crypto mining for all the reasons that were discussed in the legislature and were supported, I think, by all parties. But and so that's an example. So you make the distinction. If you're in the queue, you'd be participating in the allocation framework. But if you're a customer, such as, for example, that 140 megawatts of crypto mining, and you got in, you're a customer in good standing, and you have access to that, you continue to have access to that.
Member from Prince George, Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. So appreciate the response from the minister on that 140 megawatts. Obviously, there's going to be significant competition in the near term to make sure that there's people, trying to access that. I'm wondering if, from a risk standpoint, what the province has looked at in terms of on the data sovereignty side of things, what this means for British Columbia and Canadian data sovereignty, what federal engagement and discussions have happened on data sovereignty that relate to this bill that need to be part of that equation. We're obviously in a we're in a tariff war. We're in a very challenging situation with our neighbors to the south, and data sovereignty could be used as a threat against Canada. It's clear that could happen, and we want to make sure that we're protecting British Columbians and indeed Canadians through what we're doing if we're limiting our ability to store Canadian data on AI processing in our jurisdiction. So just wondering what federal discussions have been a part of this.
Recognize the minister.
Well, two sets of things I'd say to the member. First of all, the amount of power we're talking about, 600 megawatts of power allocated in the first 3 years for AI and for data centers is a significant amount of power, as the member would agree. The largest load right now is about 120, 130 at Highland Valley Copper, for example, largest load of any kind in the province, although we were seeing in the crypto proposals a massive scaling of that power demand in the past. So I would just note that if you're talking about that level of new power, there is significant opportunity, and so what we're saying with that opportunity, the priority should go to Canadian and BC companies. I think people would agree with that in a general sense. That would be a criteria that they address issues such as data sovereignty, jobs, community issues, and so on, and of course return to the ratepayer. All of those would be considerations in the kind of criteria that would be set up in the competition, and that would serve to benefit projects that obviously are sustaining data sovereignty. The issue isn't so much the trade war in the case of data sovereignty, but the application in countries such as France are seeing that. The application of American rules to data held by American companies in other jurisdictions. And I won't name some of the companies, but remember, could imagine what some of them are, who are major companies in this world. And that's why it's important to support data sovereignty. With the broader question of AI, of course, and its application and its participation in the economy and the research and the companies involved, not all of that is around data centers or even large consumers of electricity. Obviously, there's a much broader economy that's part of our efforts. And the Minister of Jobs is engaged with the new Minister for Artificial Intelligence federally, who's very involved in these questions, Mr. Solomon. And yes, he is leading some of those discussions about how the jurisdictions deal with these issues. And I've spoken to Mr. Solomon as well, but the lead is the minister responsible for jobs.
Member for Prince George, Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. And just to be clear, did the minister and the minister responsible for artificial intelligence speak to the federal minister and responsible for artificial intelligence on Bill 31 specifically? Was that something? And with that, my broader question wasn't, I don't think, answered in the last response. What federal feedback and what federal consultation actually happened on Bill 31?
Recognize the minister.
Well, this issue of electricity allocation for every jurisdiction in North America, as between governments, is a significant issue. You've seen the impact, for example, in American jurisdictions of large increases related in rates for the rate base for residential and commercial and industrial customers based on the rapidly scaling data industry. So this is an issue I personally discussed with the minister. When I was referring to the minister responsible for artificial intelligence, I was referring to Mr. Solomon, who's the federal minister, with obviously the Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence in BC and the Minister of Jobs, and they have the lead here in BC in those discussions. So they understand very well the issues with respect to electricity, and obviously federal officials have been briefed about this bill.
Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. And I think, appreciate the response from the minister, but I still don't think that answered my question. Was the federal government consulted on Bill 31, including Mr. Solomon?
Minister.
I discussed the issue of electricity allocation with Mr. Solomon in the summer, as have the appropriate ministers.
Member from Prince George Mackenzie.
So obviously those discussions, as we're having nation-building conversations right now across Canada, and data sovereignty being one of them. So I would be interested to learn whether the federal government finds the limiting of data storage and processing here in BC, is that a risk to federal strategies and federal aspirations when it comes to whether it's AI goals? We've heard the Prime Minister talk significantly about it. We've heard Minister Solomon talk about the same. So my question is really, what was Minister Solomon's response to that?
Recognize the minister.
Well, Mr. Solomon, of course, can speak for himself. But I would say that a process that establishes criteria that include data sovereignty, include supporting and building out Canadian industry and jobs, include these priorities, which are our joint priorities, not just our joint priorities, the priorities, I'm sure, of all provinces. They would view that as the right approach, which is not to have a first-come, first-served system where you might have a data center with hypothetically a few security guard jobs around it that are permanent. You'd want to, that's sometimes the case, and you've seen this in other jurisdictions where we've seen rapidly scaling data centers. So I think our approach of assigning a significant allocation of power, the first 3 years, 600 megawatts is a lot of power. I think everybody would agree with that. That's 5 Highland Valley Coppers, which is our largest current load, is a significant allocation of power. And then having that, having those priorities and criteria be the way in which access to that power is selected, I think is consistent with good practice and consistent with the policies not just of Canadian provinces and other states. The difference between ourselves and other provinces is in Quebec, it's the cabinet that decides on projects above 5 megawatts. The cabinet does, and the Minister of Energy does. And as interesting as that might be for ministers of energy, I don't think that's the right approach. I think the right approach is to set the economic policy and to have the utility, which does this very well, establish a competition based on public goals and priorities.
Member from Salmon Arm Shuswap.
Thank you to the chair, and my question to the minister. This goes back to allocation. We know that the transmission line is going to be following the Clean BC agenda. And we also know, we've already determined that we also purchase electricity through PowerX. So hypothetically, there's going to be a demand for power up in the Northwest. And the fact is that we could be buying power from PowerX as well. Okay, so through the transmission line, we could allocate power from the wind turbines or from wherever. On the same time, we could be buying power elsewhere because there's going to be a shortfall in the province. Is there any guarantees that we're not going to be allocating power from other jurisdictions to put through that transmission line?
Recognize the minister.
Well, we dealt with really those same questions in our extensive two-day debate on Section 1, which the member's question applies. The purpose of Section 1 is to facilitate the construction of the North Coast Transmission Line, and specifically the partnerships with First Nations involved in that line. We had that discussion, and as the member will remember, he voted against that section and disagrees with that, and that's what we do in this House. We debate and we vote, and so that's fair enough. But I think the North Coast Transmission Line gives opportunity to dozens of projects that need electricity in the Northwest potential, which will bring great wealth to the province. And we've had this debate before, and we'll have the debate about the North Coast Transmission Line again. With respect to electricity in the province, really none of the question relates to Section 2, but I'd just say generally, as I've said to him on a number of occasions before, over the last 15 years, 8 times we've exported more power than we've imported, and 7 times we've imported more power than we've exported. But because of PowerX and its extraordinary role in the system, BC's power, the ones that we export, is vastly more valuable than that which we import because of the value of our hydro system, which we owned to multiple generations before, who built those dams that are so valuable to us. It allows us to store power and use it when it is most valuable. And this gives BC a huge advantage in developing and bringing on other forms of electricity. So we're going to continue to do that. But do we need more power? Yes. We have now 2 successive calls for power. We have Site C, which is a 24% increase in generation, and multiple other projects, which I've, of course, listed out on multiple occasions during our extensive debate on Section 1.
Member from Salmon Arm Shuswap.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Minister. With all due respect to the Minister, I do believe it does pertain to Clause 2, because it has to do with allocation. So you can guarantee that, so there's a hypothetically demand for power in the Northwest, and so you have the ability to allocate power to a certain industry or a certain entity up there that needs power, but on the same token, we don't have enough power through that transmission line. So technically, you could actually buy power through PowerX, say, for instance, to the Kootenays, and they could be paying a rate in the Kootenays, which could be quite different than what's going through that transmission line if you allocate the power. Or are you guaranteeing that there will be absolutely no possibility of that happening?
Recognizing the minister.
So Section 2 deals with the establishment of an allocation framework. It limits that framework to AI, and obviously crypto is involved because there's a ban that's been established now for a couple of years, sustained in the courts, and to data centers, and potentially hydrogen for export. It enables that, although we don't see that allocation required now. So it's not just, it's not the fact that you can use the word allocation to describe other subjects that make them relevant to the section. And to say to the member lightly, in any event, BC Hydro, as I think laid out in a number of questions he's asked about these questions of export and import of power, is engaged, has just tabled with the BC Utilities Commission its integrated resources plan, which has hundreds of pages and which is under review by the BCUC, and both BC Hydro and BCUC playing their specific roles in that process. And so part of that, of course, is a special scenario for the North Coast itself, which is laid out in detail in that IRP. Of course, it's not the subject of this legislation, which considers future industrial growth, and it lays out the scenario forecast for that growth, and it justifies, I think, for all to see the building of the North Coast Transmission Line and the calls for power we've put in place. The calls for power in 24 and 25, because this question has been asked before, will add 10,000 gigawatt hours a year of electricity. Site C is now online, adding 1,100 megawatts of capacity. Revelstoke's 6 unit is under environmental review, and we're moving forward with that project. Energy efficiency programs, which are so important and have been so important in effectively avoiding power generation through conservation. And BC is world renowned for those programs, saving 2,000 gigawatts of electricity, enough for 200,000 homes, the upgrade to GM Shrum, et cetera. So we've answered this question before, and the member is asking a question of the generation of power, and that's the generation of power in BC. But again, none of that has anything to do with the specifics of Section 2, but I'm always happy to attempt to answer the member's questions.
Recognizing the member from Salmon Arm Shuswap.
I thank the chair and I thank the minister, and thank you for your continued answering of questions that are not per se little out of the range, but I do appreciate it. This goes back to a little bit of questioning yesterday regarding, we've established that the Northwest Transmission Line is an integrated system. We also established the fact that there's allocation for certain industries over other industries, and there certainly wouldn't be any power being generated through fossil fuels because we want to make sure that we have low carbon emissions. With that saying, is there a guarantee that there'll be no coal-fired or fossil fuel-generated electricity passing through that electricity line since we buy power from other jurisdictions?
Recognizing the minister.
This issue has, of course, been discussed by the committee earlier and pertains entirely to Section 1 of the bill, which passed on a division between the government and the opposition. So I understand that the member disagrees with the North Coast Transmission Line and the transmission of electricity to the North Coast and the northwest of the province, although apparently supports the interior Lower Mainland line, which took power from the north to Vancouver. That's an interesting dichotomy, but again, it's not really relevant to the section. So I would say that in BC we have something called the Clean Energy Act, which is, you'll see in all these questions fully detailed in the IRP. Clean Energy Act, which was passed not by current administration, but by Mr. Campbell's administration, that governs some of these questions. BC Hydro does have access to some peaking facilities in gas. As you know, the previous administration essentially set about to shut down Burrard Thermal, which was which provided some support to the system, and the member will remember that. So we believe that with the price coming down for clean electricity, and it's clearly indicated in the calls for power that we're producing with Site C, with the calls for power, and with the call for expression of interest, which saw responses from more than 100 participants for 19 gigawatt hours of power, clean electricity in our province. That included things that are currently slightly outside the Clean Energy Act, because we wanted to hear all of the options, including the potential for hydroelectric dams that were otherwise excluded to at least be considered in that discussion. There's massive opportunity in BC, and so the North Coast Transmission Line will reflect that huge opportunity. And of course it's a difference, and I'm not going to get back into the debate. We had the full debate yesterday about the member and other members of the opposition's proposal for small nuclear reactors on the North Coast. I just say that that's another option, but not one that I support, and obviously one that's contrary to Mr. Campbell's Clean Energy Act.
Recognizing the member from Kamloops Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just a couple questions for the minister, and it's really around trying to get an idea of where Cabinet and Hydro's decision-making thought process around regulations that would circumvent the BCUC with Clause 2 would land in regards to data centers, AI, crypto, things like that. And recognizing, you know, it's much more North Coast focused currently, but once Cabinet and Hydro start to make decisions of that sort, there would start to be reasonable expectations in other parts of the province that are a bit energy constrained as to decision making. And so I'll give a little bit of background just so the minister understands where I'm coming from on this. So in Kamloops' case, we have redundant fiber with rail lines, one of the only places west of Winnipeg that does. And so data centers are coveted in that area. So we had a smaller one in one area of town. We had another one get built up by the university. We had TELUS come in and do their big data center. You know, I was on city council at the time on that, and that data center, for as large as it is only 20% of what the full build out is for TELUS. And so there's 4 other modules, each one at that same size. We now have an AI hub coming in with the university in Shaw, right across the street from it. So there's quite a cluster already, but there's massive potential for growth. Literally all zoned, all ready to go. All TELUS would need is customers if they wanted, and they could expand. And it's been that way for quite some time. Now Hydro put a brand new substation in right next door, essentially, in that same area as power demands for the city were growing. At that time, the Ajax Mine proposal was being discussed. Residents got all nervous thinking that was a substation for that, which it wasn't. We lobbied very hard with Hydro to get extra capacity into the city because we were getting to plug in another toaster oven and we have a blackout. So, so that's a bit of that backdrop there. Now, at the same time, as you go up to North Thompson, we have other mines that are being proposed up and along the Yellowhead, and a massive power shortage in that area at the same time. And I recognize they're not interconnected fully, but it's a same geographic area, and the minister referenced Highland Valley Copper, which is in the same geographic area as well. Also, that's being said is it starts to constrain potential growth, potential industrial uses, but also residential growth. So we have a situation where we have one builder that wanted to put another 2,500 housing units in very close to that same substation. And Hydro is unwilling to easily access, and depending who you talk to, I've talked with Hydro and they walk you through the numbers and say we've got lots of capacity. You talk to the developer after they've talked with Hydro and they get told them there's no capacity for that type of development. So a bit of mixed messaging. I'm not asking the minister to solve that today. I'm just using it for a backdrop to understand why people and business and industry around the province will be looking very intently as how Cabinet starts to interpret the powers that Clause 2 would provide them to circumvent the BCUC and start to allocate or not provide power to some of those uses. And again, I use the data center in Kamloops as a good example because it's only at 20% capacity. It's been that way probably for a decade. So it's very easy to either still have power allocated and not used for housing, or eventually, if decision making is to start shifting that mindset from Hydro and the Cabinet, to start using up some of that capacity, and then suddenly have TELUS say, actually we want to expand. Where's our power that we thought we had? So it is a complicated mix, but given that this is kind of a new template that will be in place for new development in an area that doesn't have those overlapping issues at the same rate of growth and historic growth, I guess, and demands that we would see in the Kamloops case. So is the government's intention, I guess, on the prioritization of Clause 2 decision-making, regulation-making power, that priority is 100% given to pretty much everything but AI and data and crypto, or is it that it's got to fit within that first envelope of power that the minister was talking about, and anything over and above that is dead and done? Because I think the other parts of the province, as we get more and more energy constrained, as these are big investment decisions across the province. Obviously, the government is talking about trying to expedite mine permitting and forestry and other mills or value-added wood, all high-volume energy consumers. And especially if the government's trying to get those types of industries to switch away from gas-fired machinery and kilns and things of that nature to electric, it adds even more draw in a way that might not have been previously thought of. Because most of the capacity in these areas where mills have shut down over the last while has been taken up already in one form or another. So I guess I'm just trying to get a better understanding, because I've had people in my area ask about this and I didn't have a good answer for them, and I thought, well, I should come ask the minister directly what the government's intentions are in terms of moving forward for the rest of the province once they start to override the BCUC on a regulatory basis around these types of potential end users of the electricity. And is that the intention to kind of spread that out province-wide or not? Because precedence is a funny thing in government world. When someone really wants something, they tend to start to point to decisions government has made, especially if it's the same sitting government that's being asked for that.
Recognizing the minister.
Well, welcome to the member to the debate. Obviously, these issues have been intently canvassed, but I'm happy to canvass them again because he brings the experience of his community to them. I just want to correct the member. There's no overriding of the BCUC here. There's just none. The allocation of power is a BC Hydro decision, and it has been, it continues to be. And we continue to maintain in that, but in the case of the purpose of this section is for AI and for data centers, which are rapidly scalable industries, which could effectively move very quickly. That's why we did it with crypto, for example. A member will remember, he was a member in the House during the debate over the crypto ban. We did that because there's an industry where you can see 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts of demand and a first-come, first-served system effectively with very little in the way of ultimate jobs or opportunity, which would also create less opportunity for other industries. So in terms of these changes, the current system applies with this major build-out of new energy and capacity to all other industries. And we are pacing AI and data centers at 200 megawatts a year. Again, a very significant amount of power. If you're looking at the first 3 years of that, that would be 600 megawatts, which is no small thing, 5 Highland Valley Coppers. And the reason we do that is the experience everywhere. It's not just this jurisdiction that's doing it. It's jurisdictions across the United States and Canada that are making those decisions. In Quebec, it's as the member was suggesting, the minister and the cabinet have authority of all decisions over 5 megawatts. Well, that's not the approach we've taken. Cabinet will be setting criteria based on consultation, but the general approach has been laid out in our discussion here in the legislature. And then BC Hydro will be setting up a process for allocation decisions and doing it just as it does calls for power, where the process is set up. Obviously, price is important in those, but also First Nations participation in the most recent calls for power. And then the decisions are made in that process with an ethics advisor, and I find out essentially the day or the day before the announcement what the successful proponents are, and therefore the announcement of those proposals. So I think there is a great deal of opportunity. He speaks of TELUS, and I think the important reason you want to give priority, and I'm not going to talk about particular projects or anything else, obviously that'll be for the independent process to work through, but you want to ensure that businesses centered in BC and Canada, the projects that affect the data sovereignty of Canada, projects that create jobs, have priority in those processes and not someone who comes in and it requires a lot of power for very little local benefit. And that's why we have an allocation framework. We set out that. We've agreed, and in our discussions with his colleagues, that we'll certainly be hearing from them as well on the criteria in that process. And that's where we're taking it forward. So we have a very ambitious plan for generation. We're building out more transmission, in particular to the North Coast. That's section 1, not this section. And I think real opportunity for the first time in quite a long time of seeing a growth in energy demand in the province and the load, and it's up to BC Hydro in many respects to meet that load, not just BC Hydro, but Fortis in some cases and others, but BC Hydro to meet that load, and that's what we're doing, and that's all detailed for the member in the Integrated Resources Plan.
Recognize the member from Kamloops Centre.
Thank you, and I appreciate the minister and his patience with me. But so I want to be clear. I'm not a big fan of freeing up tons of power for crypto mining. I've said that publicly before. I agree. It's only a few jobs, and it's very much jobs tied specifically to crypto mining, essentially. But data centers and AI gets a little bit more nuanced in terms of the jobs. And once again, I agree in the case of the Kamloops data centers, there's not a lot of jobs on the ground, certainly a lot of construction jobs when they first fire it up and get it built, big footprint and all of that. But afterwards, the on-site techs are making sure the servers are running, and the security is a lot of automation nowadays as well. So it's not so much about that, but healthcare doesn't run without data centers. Universities don't run without data centers. Mines and others, frankly, are heavy on information technology. The large legal firms now, the large accounting firms in downtown Vancouver, you name it, the packets of information that are flowing and the storage needs those centers provide to the overall workforce in BC, I think the minister would agree, are significant. So there's not a direct correlation sometimes on those technologies as there might be with a crypto technology. I just want to say I agree with the minister if he's agreeing with that as well in terms of the job. So I guess that's what leads in, though, in terms of the concerns in coming from a part of the world where we're seeing new regulations coming in, but we already have fairly significant infrastructure around data centers, and trying to get that better understanding of the prioritization and what view the cabinet would be taking as regulations come forward in terms of that economic good that things like AI and data centers would actually provide. Will all of those other types of factors be coming into play, or is it strictly, well, once it's built, there's a few security jobs and there's a few this, so we're not really worried? Is there a way for outside industry, outside users to convey back to the cabinet? Is there going to be a process around that, so that there's a broader understanding of why that call for excuse me, a data center actually has a far larger provincial economic impact than the physical data center itself? Because if we're talking trade-offs, sometimes that's critical. If there's further expansion we could be seeing in the digital arts space and things of that nature, but they need that capacity, especially with data sovereignty concerns, especially as the minister would be very well versed as a former minister of health, data handling concerns of information being stored in the States versus in Canada, especially nowadays even more so than under the Patriot Act. One would probably think, as scary as that might sound. It just seems that the better understanding I think we have moving forward with this, assuming it passes tonight, you never know. If not, I guess we're having an election on the weekend. Yeah, well, we've both had snap elections, so it's just like old school. But really, I mean, in all seriousness, that's I think where I'm just trying to get a better understanding, so that when people in my community and that are asking these types of questions are starting, because this is a bit of a fundamental change in terms of how the government is going to start looking at dispersing out the power and that decision making. And so I think people rightly in the rest of the province are trying to figure out just what the heck this means to them long term in terms of moving forward. So if we get a bit better idea, if I could get a bit better idea, and if it's already been asked, I do apologize. I was tied up in some other chambers over the multiple days you've been dealing with this, but just around that decision making again in clause 2, that will look at data centers and AI, and is it taking that broader economic impact view of it, because they are a little unique in the service that they do wind up providing on that economic impact lens, versus a mine's pretty easy to tell what economic impact the mine directly is going to do with direct and indirect jobs. The pulp mill is very clear to understand. A data center is much more nuanced in terms of that customer base, whether or not it's even NBC customers or not that are going to be providing or needing that provision of services, and just what that actually means to the overall economy.
Rick?
Yeah,
The minister?
thank you very much, Honourable Chair, and thanks to the member for his question. These are important questions, and ones that our jurisdictions really across North America have been addressing, in different ways. The obligation to serve was taken away from Utah utilities over 100 megawatts, for example, which is a significant thing in that case, because they were seeing such pressure from this sector, rapidly scalable, and different than a mine, I think it's fair to say. And we want to make sure, and obviously a lot of the North Coast Transmission Line, but also what we want to do in the members region as well. There's a significant possibilities elsewhere in the interior for mining. We want to make sure that those jobs and those developments, which will bring, especially with clean electricity, a huge reduction in GHGs, which is important on the one hand, but also jobs and royalties and resources to a province over a period of time, along the lead up into them sometimes, for them to start. And then mines that are there for 30, 40, 50 years, the data center and AI center industries where there is massive building right now in the United States and in jurisdiction are different than that. We want to make sure, therefore, that as we're allocating power, and other jurisdictions such as Manitoba, Quebec, Alberta are doing different things, but that we would set aside a very significant amount of power. And then the Cabinet's role is not to dictate the winners and losers, but to say exactly what the member says. And I'd be very interested in his contribution to it and what he thinks should be the priority. But what I've said generally is absolutely jobs and economic contribution, which, as he knows, and I think he just described it, can be direct and indirect, especially when you're talking about attracting people to TRU or some question such as that. So direct and indirect. Obviously value to BC Hydro and to the ratepayer, and you see that allowance in the legislation. Issues of data sovereignty, issues of the important companies that have been here a long time that are building out their companies. It would be important for those companies, it seems to me, to continue to have access to electricity in this area, more so than someone coming from outside who just wants to set up a data center because we offer, say, inexpensive electricity. And so I would hope he would agree with me, and the reason we have this section is that shouldn't be first come, first served, that we set out those criteria on that basis, which I think, we'll see what happens. We won't be directing the competition, so we won't know exactly what happens, but the criteria, Kamloops is certainly a community ideally suited to do well in those kind of competitions because of existing infrastructure, because of the involvement of companies such as TELUS, but not just TELUS, Bell and others, right, in the region, to economic development there. Other regions such as Prince George, the member who asked the previous questions, are obviously very well suited to that as well, and already are participants in this. We have data centers in BC now. The final thing I'd say is all of AI and all of its evolution and development is not about electricity. So, and there's a huge part of it that is not, and does not require a lot of electricity, and BC companies are leaders in that area, and I know the member will be aware of that from the work that he does. So that's the approach. We set up the criteria together. BC Hydro runs the competition based on those criteria, and it's the criteria I think the member is talking about, which is really the value to British Columbia as described in these different elements that allows us to do that, as opposed to having a system in such a rapidly scalable set of industries that's based on first come, first serve.
Member from Kamloops Centre.
Thank you. Well, and so, I know the minister fully understands this, but, we're talking about, transmission lines and generation, which obviously span hundreds and literally thousands of kilometers in some case in BC. You're talking about data centers that don't have to be next to their user, obviously. They're all about where the fiber is located, and they need access to water and they need access to power. And the customer is somewhat irrelevant as long as there's fiber heading off to those areas. They can get the data packs off that they need back and forth. And obviously, over the years, fiber's expanded greatly in the province in terms of smaller communities and things like that. So, but the impact of whether that data center then ultimately gets to operate or not, even though it may be far afield, can still have very serious ramifications, say to a downtown Vancouver, where you could have the client wanting access. And I'll use digital arts as an example, just because I think it's easy for everyone to conceptualize. They use large volumes of data to do the graphics and everything else they do. But they also consume a heck of a lot of power as well, even though they're not a mine. Nowhere near Highland Valley, I agree. It's quite the tour if anyone hasn't gone there. Anytime you drive there, you're always hearing the power lines buzzing. You're close. But I digress. So back to the digital arts side of it. you know, there's only so much electricity out there for them to keep expanding and things of that nature as well. But we're faced with right now an ever-moving, and again, with the minister's indulgence, he'll get to where I'm meandering around to here in a minute. There's only a finite, as we keep hearing and discussing, finite amount of power, despite the power calls and the timelines that those are going to come on and everything else. And I prefer to view what happens in the province as an energy grid than more so an electrical grid and a gas grid, for lack of a better term, because both are used for power and for energy. And so when Vancouver has a cold snap, 2/3 of the energy consumed is actually natural gas, not electricity. You can't keep up. The grid would not handle it. The electrical grid would not handle it. And so when we have situations where municipalities, now we're asking questions about cabinet being able to make power allocation decisions, and that's one thing, because the government and hydro are one and the same, frankly, but mayors aren't. And so mayors and councils that make decisions around banning natural gas usage in a municipality can and may be fundamentally changing, whether hydro likes it or not, or the minister likes it or not, where some of the power allocation in this province on those transmission lines is going to have to flow to meet the power and the energy needs. And I say energy, not just electrical needs, energy needs of certain regions of the province, because they essentially overrode the cabinet and hydro, BCUC, everybody, by just making a local bylaw saying no more natural gas. It's like if they said there's no more electricity allowed in our city, everything has to be run on natural gas electricity. I think the minister might have something to say about that. And so the concern I've been having for a while here is that as we have, and I know how power constrained Kamloops was when we were asking hydro for several years, lobbying quite aggressively to get that extra new substation in. I know Kelowna at the same time was incredibly starved for electricity. They seem to be growing now, so I'm assuming that got addressed somewhat. I know the North Thompson is starved for power, and that's holding back a lot of growth in that area. So there's areas in this province that have been, you know, biding their time, waiting for that energy to be made available to them, sitting back and watching municipalities in other jurisdictions being able to essentially superinflate how much electrical demand is needed because they're banning natural gas, which is an energy source. Now, I have no problem if the province over time, in conjunction with BC Hydro and Fortis in an orderly and logical fashion, actually implements the weaning off of natural gas and reduction of natural gas. But it should be actually provincial control of the energy needs of British Columbia, not municipality by municipality, mayor by mayor, randomly deciding whether or not this term for 4 years they're going to ban something, and then 4 years later a new mayor comes in and council comes in and they change their mind, and then we're whipsawing back and forth. So if the government is willing to take the steps that they have in clause 2 here, which is to start by way of cabinet, decide allocations, why have they not taken those same steps when it comes to the overall energy within British Columbia? Because yes, crypto, yes, all those others consume a lot of electricity, but so do large cities. But large cities also need a lot of natural gas to augment it, for heat and for other things when there's a cold snap especially. So I'm just trying to understand why it's good enough for something new like the North Coast transmission line to say, no, we need to take control of this as a cabinet and make sure that we are allocating properly the limited power resources we have for maximum benefit. But if you're in the Lower Mainland, community by community, can kind of put a thumb in the middle of those allocation plans, recognizing generation is not happening for the most part in the Lower Mainland, and still, you know, we have other communities that are desperately looking for power for expansion, for housing growth, and they run that very real risk of being leapfrogged because hydro is going to have to prioritize getting more capacity into areas that they maybe hadn't planned on out of necessity, but they now have to because a mayor and a council have suddenly made that necessity happen versus the natural growth of a city and the natural growth of the hydro grid that had been planned 10 years earlier. So I hope that kind of makes sense to the minister. In my weird head, it makes sense to me how I phrased it, but maybe not to everyone. But that's really, you know, the crux of when I read clause 2. I'm like, okay, so the cabinet's willing to step in and start. The minister doesn't like picking winners and losers, but figuring out highest and best use allocations, we'll say then, from a limited pool of transmission capacity that will be. But there's a limited pool everywhere of transmission capacity. And we do have that very real impact. When 2/3 of the energy consumed in a cold snap is not hydro generated power, there's an energy gap if natural gas is banned. And so I'm just wondering how this will play out long-term in the minister's mind. If we're doing it for one area of the province, are we not taking that same lens, again, precedent setting? And if so, then why are we allowing municipalities to essentially start to dictate the overall energy grid at the expense of one energy source over the other?
Recognizing the minister.
I'll just wait for a moment.
Okay, we'll call a recess
Until after the division.
until after the division vote. and resume discussion on Bill 31, Clause 2. Minister?
Thank you. We just finished hearing my friend from Kamloops give a presentation where he got some thoughts he has on certain municipalities on the record. And as a long-standing member of the opposition prior to becoming government minister, I truly appreciated that performance and that effort. I want to acknowledge that and say that this may be tangential, but it's substantive to what he said, that increasingly we're working together with other utilities, Pacific Northern Gas, Fortis, and BC Hydro, working together, looking at all of the assumptions informing their IRPs. And what we're starting to see, as all sides present their IRPs to the BC Utilities Commission, we're seeing the benefits of that work that is being done together for a community such as Kamloops. And I think the member spoke eloquently about his concern for Kamloops. I think the clarity brought by these rules and this process is much better than a process where you have rapidly scaling demand and choices made not on the public interest, but rather on more random considerations. And I think this is the right approach. It particularly benefits communities like Kamloops, but others in BC. So the kind of concern the member has for different utilities and different forms of energy is obviously a concern for all of the utilities of the province and something they're working closely on together.
Recognizing the leader of the third party?
House
House leader, pardon me. House leader, pardon me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thought you were just here to see the answer to that last question.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on the earlier question of my colleague and just understand, and this may once again have been covered earlier, but just so I can fully understand, how is climate change factored into the establishment of criteria?
Recognizing the minister?
Well, I think it's reflected, first of all, in the existence of an allocation framework in this area, ensuring that BC's clean electricity, low-cost electricity, is used in the best possible way for the people of BC. So it's fundamentally a climate change initiative. As we set out the criteria, there will be potentially climate change related considerations, such as some AI centers being able to reuse heat and reuse energy effectively, making them more efficient and contributors as well to the grid. So that would be one of the considerations, and probably one suggested by the honourable member and his colleagues, because certainly I'll be reaching out to members of the opposition to hear what they think is our priorities as well. So that would be potentially one of the considerations we'd let out, and then it would be obviously assessed by BC Hydro as they go through the allocation process and competition.
Recognize the leader of the third party, House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. As a follow-up question, there are going to be a variety of factors or criteria that are established through a consultation process, whether it relates to job creation or climate change or impact, for example, of data centers on water usage and so on. How will the decision be made about the respective weighting of those factors in a final allocation decision?
Recognizing the minister.
So that would be part of the consultation, the regulations, how you would weight them. Just give the member an example, and that's parallel in the call for power. The First Nations consideration in the call for power was different than, say, price considerations or other considerations. We said was that all of the successful proponents would have to have minimum 25% to 51% First Nations ownership. In the case, that's obviously a very different weighting. It's essentially 100% weighting, all of them. all of the participants would have to meet that criteria, and whereas price is obviously important in all of this, would be a different consideration. So that would be part of the discussion around the regulations, and then BC Hydro would manage the process and, if you will, choose those that get power allocated and those that don't.
Shall Clause 2 pass?
Aye.
No, division has been called.
Press this 4 times.
Okay, before putting the question, I remind all members that only the members of Section A or their duly appointed substitutes are authorized to vote. The question is, shall Clause 2 pass? Those in favor, please rise or otherwise indicate. Thank you. You may be seated. Those voting nay, please rise or otherwise indicate. Thank you, members. You may be seated. Clerk?
Those voting aye. Those voting nay, L. Neufeld, Williams, Mock, Valeriot, 4.
The motion is carried, and we shall move on to Clause 3. Shall Clause 3 pass? Aye. So ordered. Shall Clause 4 pass? Aye. So ordered. Shall Clause 5 pass? Aye. So ordered. And shall the title pass? Aye. So ordered. Recognizing the minister.
Thank you, with appreciation to the opposition critics, member for Salmon Arm Shuswap, member for East River South, and all members who participated in the debate, and the leader of the third party. Honourable Speaker, Honourable Chair, I move that the committee rise and report the bill complete without amendment.
You've heard the question. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried. This committee stands adjourned.
I call the Committee of the Whole on Bill 25, Housing and Municipal Affairs Statutes Amendment Act 2025. We are on Clause 4. Shall Clause 4 pass? Aye. Aye. I'm sorry.
Said I had asked the last question upstairs. We were, yes, thank you. My apologies,
I misunderstood.
Speaker,
There is still a
yeah.
remaining question. Member, please proceed.
Yes, because I was responding to the minister's response to the last question, which was, we have no intention of doing regulations for some time that is not yet defined. But my question is, why would we be rushing through legislation in the absence of knowing we're now going to be work on the regulations to advance the legislation?
Minister.
Thanks. We aren't rushing anything. It's standard practice for legislation to provide regulation-making authority to ensure policy objectives are achieved and that knowledge gained during implementation and monitoring can be addressed.
Member.
Thank you. When we're asking questions around what would the regulations say, the response has been that we don't. We'll consult, we haven't determined, it's going to be some way down the road, but when that we're inquiring about how far down the road, the answer is there is no rush to put in the regulations. So I'm confused around why we're rushing to do the legislation. What happened with Bill 44 is very indicative of what I fully expect will happen with Bill 25 or 25, because at Bill 44, the response was no regulations for some time, and within days we had 56 pages of regulations. So if we intend on putting regulations in once the bill allows that to happen, what is the timeline for consultation before those regulations get initiated?
Minister.
Thanks. I'll just start by saying the member's characterization of regulations after Bill 44 is not correct. The intent of this legislation, as I have said many times, is about consistent application of the small-scale multi-unit housing policy, and we, where there has been a difference in interpretation of the regulations, will work with local governments to ensure consistent application. If there were regulations down the road, they would be based on the site standards and adapted to specific site conditions, as we have canvassed many times already around road space or snow removal or hazards, etc.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, shall Clause 4 pass?
Aye.
Do you want, sorry, may I? Division? Division has been called. Thank you. So seeing that we have members here, do we have agreement to waive time?
Hearing no opposition.
Seeing no opposition.
The question is.
The question is, on clause 4, shall the clause pass? All members, sorry, my apologies. Wrong one. Yeah, thank you. Members voting in favor, please rise. You may be seated. Members voting against, please rise. You may be seated. Madam Clerk?
Those voting aye, Boyle, Shaw, Popham, Young, Gibson, Botterill, 6. Those voting nay, Luck, Williams, Mock, 3.
Thank you. Clause passes. We are now moving on to clause 5. Shall clause 5 pass? Aye. Carried? So ordered. Thank you. So it's getting really close to Christmas, I can tell. Clause 6, shall clause 6 pass? I recognize the member to ask a question.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, there's not any problem at all having a little jocularity around here. It's tough enough for doing our jobs as it is, so we can smile a little bit. It certainly doesn't hurt. So clause number 6, why was section 784 repealed?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. This is a housekeeping amendment. It simply repeals a spent transitional provision that had no meaning anymore.
Shall clause 6 pass? Aye. So ordered. Shall clause 7 pass? Aye. Recognizing the member for a question?
Clause 7, can the minister please explain how compliance will be measured with this clause?
Minister.
Thanks. Local government must give the minister written notice as soon as practical after the local government adopting the zoning bylaw necessary to comply.
Shall clause 7 pass? Aye. So ordered. Shall clause 8 pass? Recognizing the member.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a couple of questions around clause 8 we have here. Can we please get some clarity around why the dates in this section, in this particular section, were moved to 2026? It might be consistent with other ones, but let's go on this one here.
Minister.
Thanks. This clause amends dates to align with new compliance and extension application requirements, substituting 2026 for where it currently states 2024. It's simply a necessary amendment to ensure functionality of this section due to other changes in the bill.
Recognizing the member.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So how many municipalities have sought extensions under the 2023 framework?
Minister.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. There were 18 approved extensions.
Recognizing the member.
Thank you, Minister. So will municipalities that already sought extensions, will they be required to complete them again or ask for extensions again, or have they completed those under the extension that they were already given?
Minister.
Thanks. They would not need to reapply if they've already got an extension. It would stand.
Madam Speaker.
No, we got to finish clause 8 first, right? You got a question for clause 8?
No,
No.
finish clause 8.
Yeah, but we got to vote on it though.
We are
Oh,
right.
we
We are
have
on
to
clause 8
vote
now.
on it. What a
Yes,
concept.
we do have to vote on clause 8. So just confirming you have no more questions on clause 8. Okay. Thank you so much. So then shall clause 8 pass? Aye. So ordered. On clause 9, shall clause 9 pass? Aye. Recognizing the member.
Thank you. Can the minister confirm that this new clause only applies to future cabinet regulations made under section 481.3 and not to the base zoning obligations already set out in the statute?
Minister.
Thanks. Yes, I can confirm that.
Recognizing the member.
Thank you. What information does the minister require in an application for an extension?
Minister.
Thanks for the question. When the original small-scale multi-unit housing legislation was introduced, extensions were available for areas where infrastructure was being upgraded. Upgrades were required to avoid risks to health, public safety, or the environment, or for extraordinary circumstances similar to the original. I keep wanting to say small-scale multi-unit housing legislation. The proposed legislative changes will provide an opportunity for local governments to request an extension to comply with the new unit level density requirements using the same criteria, and extensions would be granted to no later than December 31st, 2030.
Member.
Just to clarify, same criteria as Bill 44, extensions. Okay. Why must applications be submitted 30 days before the compliance date?
Minister. Thanks. So that the minister has time to consider before the deadline.
Thank you.
Member.
Thank you. That's what I thought you'd say, but I need to drink water. What is classified as an extraordinary circumstance under subsection 2B and 3, sub 3?
Minister.
Thanks. A local government could apply with what they may consider to be an extraordinary circumstance, and then we would engage with them on that. And I move that the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again.
Thank you. Members have heard the question. Those in favor, please indicate aye. Aye. Those opposed, please indicate nay. Motion is carried. This committee stands adjourned.